If you can hear this and I sound stuffy, it's because that I am. All right. Allergies. Look, this year's allergy season is kicking my ass. I do apologize. Really, I do. It seems no matter how many Benadryls I take, my nose is just super stuffy. So excuse me for that. Also, if you hear some labored breathing, excuse me for that as well. I am recovering from some minor health issues, but I'm feeling much better today than I was last week. But I had to come back to do this show because the Joe Budden podcast seems to be splitting up, and I kind of wanted to give my thoughts on the entire thing and really break down what I think happened and what some lessons you can take away from this, right? So let's start here. Do I feel like Joe Budden wronged Rory and Mal? No, I do not. Let me tell you why. I've been a fan of Joe Budden ever since I saw one of his videos on YouTube, right? And so I was somebody who fell in love with Joe, the personality, before I fell in love with Joe the rapper and Joe the podcaster. So I was following Joe back when he was doing his Joe Budden TV videos with with his friends and his girlfriends, and it was really entertaining. He was always behind the camera usually, so you just kind of heard his voice, and I thought he was very entertaining. And then once he started podcasting, of course I was going to listen because I like the dude's insight. I like his personality. I think he's funny, he's charismatic. And so I was like, yeah, I'm going to listen to this podcast, right? And so Joe created the podcast. I'll listen to the podcast later with him, Marissa, and Rosenberg. And then it was him, Marissa, and Rory. And then he got rid of Marissa, brung in Mal. And then Mal and Rory went on their little strike. And then he brought in Isha Nice to fill in. And then Rory and Mal came back for one podcast, then a second podcast. And then they didn't show up for this most recent podcast. And so Joe got rid of their asses. Now, if I'm analyzing this entire situation, I don't think it's fair to just look at this through who's right and who's wrong, right? Because really, it's much more complicated than that. I want to approach this from the perspectives from the two sides, right? So let's analyze Joe's perspective, right? And so Joe did a podcast recently where he kind of went through the entire situation from his point of view, what he thought this was really about, which was accounting and auditing. That Rory and Mal, they think that Joe is not giving them their fair share of the pie, whether that be simply more money or part ownership of the Joe Budden podcast or not. And so Joe said, no, you're not getting ownership of this thing. This is mine. I built this, which he did. And hold on. And since you guys keep trying to, ask for this information, I'm going to get rid of you two. And so he did, right? Now, some people have said that Joe should give Rory and Mal a piece of ownership of this podcast or pay them more or whatever, because Joe's been talking for years about creators getting paid and getting their fair share, et cetera, et cetera. And some people view Joe in this instance that he's acting like the label, and he's not remembering that he needs to act more in the best interest of the creators. In this case, the creatives will be Rory and Mal. But here's the thing, though. Joe Budden is the Joe Budden podcast. See, we have to start there before we move on to anything else. This is not a podcast that is run by three personalities equally. Podcasts have like certain types, right? So you have the Joe Rogan type podcast, right? Which is, it's heavily guest driven, right? You have kind of the Brilliant Idiots with Charlamagne and Andrew Schultz, right? Where both of them kind of are equal in importance to the podcast and bring their own fan bases to this thing so it works, right? Then you have, other podcasts where it's kind of a gang of people and, they kind of plug and play certain members that come on certain days. The Joe Budden podcast operates more so like the solar system, in my opinion, right? So Joe is the sun and his friends are the planets around him. And see, where this became most evident is when Rory and Mal went on strike, and then Joe kind of brought Ice and Nishan to fill in. And, the podcast was shaky for like a show and a half. But then from there, it kind of took off. And the conversation, in my opinion, got much better, much more honest, and more refreshing. And then once, Rory and Mal came back, I think they kind of realized, wow, we are replaceable because you guys are replaceable. And so from Joe's perspective, why would I give you ownership of my podcasting? Why would I give you, in the case of Rory, my YouTube money? I've really stopped up, guys, right? So why would I give you YouTube money, my YouTube money? It's my YouTube money, right? Why would I give that to you when you are easily replaceable? That's a pretty strong argument from Joe Budden's side. Now, from the Rory and Mal side, their perspective on this is probably, hey, we helped you build this podcast, which is true. I think Joe said that Mal came in around episode 77. So yes, Rory and Mal played a role in building the Joe Budden podcast, but they were not equal to Joe. And I think that's kind of where the wires got crossed, because from Rory and Mal's perspective, their argument is, hey, we helped you build this thing. We would like to know, okay, how much money is this podcast generating, right? So basically, Joe said that they wanted to see the books. So they wanted to see, hey, what is the podcast generating? How much money is coming in from ads? How much money is coming in from, YouTube, so that we can get our fair share of this. And Joe said that Rory asked for ownership stake in the podcast right around the time they were going into the Spotify deal, and Joe told him no, right? And so from Rory and Mal's perspective, here's the thing. When you're the employee, you always look to expand your power, right? I think even Joe would agree with me. You always look to see how much power can you grab, how much more valuable how much more value can you gain? I'm so stuffed up. I'm sorry, guys. How much value can you gain so that you are irreplaceable? And so in certain respects, the mindset of Rory and Mal was wrong. But the problem is, when you make your move, you have to be very careful when you make it, because they made their move trying to kind of sabotage the podcast. Really, if we're being honest, what Rory and Mal were hoping was they go on strike, the podcast kind of tanks or stops. That's what they were really hoping for, because Mal, when they came back to talk about what happened, Mal said he was offended that Joe brought on Ice and Ish. And he said, I can't believe you would rather bring in some people than try to deal with our issue, which I think is crazy. Mal, this is a business. You can't just stop everything just because you guys are hashing out your differences. That's not how business works. What they were hoping for, in my opinion, Rory and Mal were hoping that, hey, their absence would tank the numbers. This way, Joe would succumb to whatever their demands were behind the scenes. The problem with that is they didn't see the Ice and Ish train coming. That train came. The numbers kind of went down initially, but then steadily built back up. People were enjoying it. And I think they realized, wow, I don't have any leverage anymore. And that's when, after a month, they came back. And then they try to pull another coup this time, and Joe kind of washed his hands with it. And so Rory and Mal are trying to gain power, as you should, as an employee. I think they overstepped their bounds, and they're paying the consequences. Because from Joe's perspective, he's right. You can't pull a coup on a podcast, not show up twice, and expect things to continue as if, we're all good. We are not all good, because you guys keep doing this. And now I can't even trust you anymore. Right? I think they also just kind of went to the Patreon stuff. And so it was a very delicate time for the podcast as well. Right? And so Rory and Mal, they swung at the king. They just missed. And now, they're paying for it. Now, based on everything I'm seeing, this is not the end. It looks like there are going to be a lot of legal stuff happening behind the scenes, back and forth between these two entities. And I wonder if Joe is kind of prepared for, the future, because I don't remember whose quote this is, but somebody said that the worst enemy you can have is an ex-friend, right? And so in the case of Rory, Joe said that Rory kind of came around in 2015. So that's kind of a new friend, but Mal, it seems like they have years. And so I wonder if Joe is prepared for how ugly this can potentially get now that one of his old friends seems to be an enemy. And if Joe is still interacting with these individuals as with kid gloves because of an ex-friendship, he can really mess himself up, because he's not he can really mess himself up because he is not operating or engaging with these people with the necessary level of hostility. Because if someone is bringing hostility towards you, you have to either bring hostility back to them, or you can be less hostile, but fully engaged and knowing that, hey, this person is trying to take me out. And I think Rory and Mal are absolutely trying to take Joe Budden out. So it wouldn't shock me if within the next couple of weeks you start seeing rumors about things that from Joe Budden's past come back up, or people leaking things about certain secrets of his in the news. This has the potential to get really, really bad and really, really nasty. And so, look, man, I'm a Joe Budden fan. I'm subscribed to his Patreon. I'm going to continue to support Joe Budden because I like him. But once again, I don't view this kind of as a choosing sides things. I think each side has their perspective, but nothing like this. Nothing Joe has said so far, I view as Joe, you're wilding. I understand his side. The podcast is his podcast. He has the IP. He created it. He works the hardest. One thing he brought up is he said, these two dudes, they don't really work that hard, really. They come into the podcast sometimes. He said this. They come in, and sometimes, they haven't listened to music and knowing that they have to talk about it. They haven't been paying attention to what's going on in celebrity news, knowing that they have to talk about it. And as a podcaster myself, I can absolutely understand that level of frustration that when you have co-hosts that don't seem to care as much about the podcast as you do, because remember this, Joe Budden is the actual creative here. Rory and Mal are not creatives. They're friends of Joe's. In fact, I'm pretty sure that either both or one of them have said they don't really care that much about podcasting. So how can you be on a podcast with one of the best podcasters and not care about podcasting? It's because you're not really putting in that work, really. And so Rory and Mal, all they were really doing is coming in, sitting down for 2 hours, freewheeling it while Joe was doing the planning. Joe was doing the topics. Joe was the guy guiding the conversation. Look, for this stuff here, there's a lot of pre-work that goes in. Even if you're not writing things down, just like thinking constantly during the week, make sure you're paying attention on things in the news. In the case of Joe Budden's podcast, listening to the proper music because you have to talk about it because you're kind of the music guys in the podcasting world. And so if you're not doing those things, because I had a guy like that for my first podcast, my guy, Tony, who would kind of come in and not watch the news, apparently. Right? Like, I thought we're talking about the obvious. These are like, mainstream media stories that I thought were interesting to talk about that I would like to discuss here. And my co-host, Tony, didn't really bother to really listen to anything in the news, watch the news, really read the newspaper, even check his Twitter. He wasn't on social media, paying attention, right? And so it's kind of hard when you're pulling that weight and your co-host isn't doing the same thing. And Joe kind of made the point that this is kind of what Rory and Mal was doing. And I can absolutely see that that was the case. And so, look, maybe I'll come back tomorrow with like a deeper analysis. I don't know. I just wanted to get my initial thoughts out there about what happened. But yeah, I don't think Joe did anything wrong. I feel for Rory and Mal because we all want kind of more power. Like I said, when you're an employee, you have an obligation to try to make yourself the most valuable employee there is. All right. So that's basically trying to go from an employee to a supervisor, from a supervisor to a manager, from manager to a CEO, right? You want to climb the company. In this case, I think they try to go from employee to on the board. And that wasn't the case. So let me know your thoughts. Thank you for listening. For those listening, thank you for watching on YouTube. For those watching, I'd love to hear your thoughts on the on my video here. Once again, apologies for the nose. I'm stuffed up. I hope I'm better tomorrow or whenever's the next show. I hope I'm better. But thank you for rocking with me. I will see you guys next time. Deuces.